it's the show. Welcome. Welcome. Now is the time that we're starting. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for coming out. Thank you. So thank you. This is, we're here to talk. We'll be talking shortly with Dr. Julia Shaw, the author of The Science, Evil, The Science Behind Humanity's Dark Side. That's what we're here for tonight. I'm obviously not Dr. Julia Shaw. I'll be introducing Dr. Julia Shaw, and I'll be talking to her. And if you're like, who's going to introduce you? I'm going to introduce me. I'm Misha Glouberman. A lot of you know me. I think a lot of you don't know me, but you will gradually come to know me over the course of the evening and form an impression. If you don't know who I am, I want to give you the context of sort of what this series is and what we're doing here. So this is part of what's called the How to Talk to People About Things conversation series, and this is a thing that it's still kind of new, so I'm excited about it and a little nervous. And it's a new series. It is a very slow series. To give you the sense of the series, the last one was 10 months ago, and we did one 3.5 years before that. So we are accelerating, and we're actually planning to do one this summer. So eventually it'll be like one every minute, but we're getting there. But anyhow, that's the series. And if you know some of the stuff that I do, I think some of the people. Some people know me from something I do called the Trampoline Hall Lecture Series, which is that almost sounded like a yelp of pain. Which is well in keeping with the evil theme of the evening. So Trampoline Hall is if you haven't been, or if you have, it's a lecture series that takes place in a bar, and the premise is that people cannot speak on subjects on which they are professionally expert. I host it. It was invented by my friend Sheila Heddy many years ago, and we've been doing it forever, and it always sells out, so get tickets now. That's one thing that I do. Another thing that you can't actually get tickets now. Another thing that I do is I help people, the main work that I do nowadays is I help people learn to communicate better. I help people talk about difficult issues. I help people learn to resolve conflicts, to talk about what really matters, to talk about tough things. And I do most of this. I teach classes to people and to organizations, which are just actually people in buildings, sometimes not even in buildings. Although mostly the organizations are in buildings, I should say. But I teach these classes, and the classes are called How to Talk to People About Things. And we thought, well, that's a catchy name that no one has trouble forgetting. Let's use that for the series, too. So that's the name of the series. And the series is kind of, for me, just, it sort of combines both these things. It's like a lecture series like Trampoline Hall, but it's also about, my hope is that the theme for the series is sort of about how people can kind of better understand each other and empathize with each other and do things like that. And I think that the book that we talk about today is really on topic for that. So I'm tremendously excited about it. The other way, if you know my work, is you can think like, oh, the problem with, if you don't like Trampoline Hall because there's non-experts, this is the opposite. We have got like a hell of an expert with us tonight, a really expert. The last one, if you were at the last one, we had David McCraney, who talked about how minds changed, and he's an expert, but he doesn't have a doctorate, which is, so tonight, he's just some guy. Yeah, whatever. Mr. David McCraney was here with imparting his folksy wisdom to the crowd. But tonight we have Dr. Julia Shaw, and she's done a few things. Well, she's done like an astounding number of things, actually. One of them is she's written this book called Evil, The Science Behind Humanity's Dark Side. And just these ideas, I think, are so important. I actually heard her talking. I first became aware of the book, hearing her talk on David McCraney's podcast, and I just heard that, and I was like, oh my God, I really want to talk to this person. And then, amazingly, here she is. That's how my thoughts work. You should try it sometime. Anyhow, so we'll be talking about the book. We'll probably be talking about some other stuff, which is kind of my hope for this series. I'm still kind of figuring it out, but my hope is that partly we talk about the book, and partly we talk about just the author and what they're up to and all that kind of stuff. This is like the interesting behind-the-scenes stuff that you probably don't need to know. You're probably thinking, Misha, you should introduce her now, so I will. I'm going to read the bio. This is like the official bio, where you'll see what I talk about when I say that she's an expert. She is a scientist in the Department of Psychology at University College London, and the author of the international best-selling book, The Memory Illusion, so not just this one, but that one. Her academic work, teaching, and her role as an expert witness have focused on different ways of understanding criminal behavior. She has consulted as an expert on criminal cases, delivered police training and military workshops. She's evaluated offender diversion programs. She also is the co-founder of Spot, which we'll probably talk about. That's a startup that helps employees report workplace harassment and discrimination, and employers take action using like an app and artificial intelligence, which is amazing. Her work has been featured in outlets such as CNN, the BBC, The New Yorker, The Guardian, Der Spiegel, Wired, and Forbes. Please, a very warm welcome for Dr. Julia Shah.
Thank you. Julia, expert Shah.
You are an expert, and that's like, and you're an expert on evil now.
I don't know that you can be an expert on evil.
That's what an evil person would say.
Oh. Yeah, I'm not sure that that's a thing, but I do like being able to talk about why people do bad things and getting you all to challenge yourselves a bit more and think about the darkness that might lurk in all of us rather than othering people and saying, ooh, those people are evil, we can't ever understand them.
I'm just so in agreement with this. Like, part of me is like, I want this to be a conversation, and then as I was preparing for the conversation, I was just like, oh, yes, that's true, that's true. And I was like, so I don't think it'll be a problem.
Not a very good debate when it's just
agreement. But I think we'll figure it out. But one of the, I guess when you talk about that expertise, one thing that I'm really curious about is how, like, you really do see, like, you have this like delight when you talk about this stuff, and I'm curious how, and one of the things you write about in the book is you talk about, I think you say like, oh, I've been interested in this for, I don't remember how many years, it was a lot of years. And I'm curious like how far back this interest goes and what led to you being so interested in this.
Well, I studied criminal psychology, so at the latest then, but the bigger question, I guess, is why did I study criminal psychology in the first place? There's the honest story, and there's the fun story.
Tell us the glossed over lie.
Tell us
the honest story.
So when I was really, tell you the real story.
You can tell us both. Let's start with the real story.
Tell you both. Yeah. The real story. The real story is I was studying psychology in undergrad at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, or near Vancouver. Right?
people like your Simon Fraser.
People who have been there know it's not really. I mean, much cheaper housing. But yeah, so I was at Simon Fraser University, and I was taking these classes on psychology, and I thought at that point I wanted to be a clinical psychologist.
Right.
Well, sort of. I say that. I'm the first person in my family to go to university, so my immediate goal was just to like make it through undergrad. And then I met this person called Stephen Hart, who is a professor at Simon Fraser who does risk assessment research, and he was awesome. He just made it feel like these issues had real impact and could really change people's lives in a way that one-on-one treatment couldn't, and in a way that really affected not just the people receiving treatment, but society at large. It was also just really cool. Like, I'm like, oh, I like your leather jacket. Psychologists can take themselves really seriously, and that doesn't fit with my personality at all.
And so he was teaching criminal psychology?
He was teaching criminal psychology. He was teaching a course on risk assessment, and actually...
I don't know, when you said risk assessment...
What does that mean?
I thought, oh, what is airplanes not falling out of the sky or whatever?
Risk assessment for dangerous offenders. So he worked, for example, on the Robert Pickton case. So he was actively working on that during my undergrad, which was really fascinating. And so he had us, for example, try to do a PCLR, the psychopathy checklist, so to determine whether someone might be a psychopath. On, for example, I chose Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka.
Right.
And so we did things like that, sort of to see, how do we apply psychology in the real world settings, and how do we assess how risky behavior is and how risky people are. And he was, by the way, the sort of academic child, my academic father, but someone's academic child, of Robert Hare, who's the person who actually developed the concept of psychopathy that we understand today. So my academic grandfather.
So you're like the granddaughter
I'm the
of
granddaughter.
the inventor of psychopaths.
Right. And we disagree, as children do, with their grandparents on most things, but it is fun to see that lineage. It only sunk in this week that that's the case.
Wow.
Yeah.
So the thing that actually made you interested was like I didn't even know, like a compelling and charismatic university professor.
Yeah, and just the most wonderful human being. I mean, he was just amazing. And he effectively said, you're really interested in this, why don't you go to grad school? Which hadn't really occurred to me until that point that was even an option available to me.
Wow.
And then he just sort of kept pushing me. And here I am, so.
Did he make you come to this? Was he like, you have to go to Toronto and talk at the Arts and Letters Club? Misha's the guy you should talk to.
No, but genuinely, like, inspiring teachers. If any of you are teachers or educators, I mean, you could really change people's lives, so. Good on you.
That's awesome. Amazing. Okay. So I want to, Now I kind of want to hear the fake glib answer too. Yeah, everyone wants to hear the fake glib answer. It's not a very authentic crowd here. So what's the?
They like the lies.
Yeah.
I have always been interested in why people do bad things. I have a family history of people doing bad things, which is true as well.
Yeah.
It's just a bit less true because it wasn't what pushed me into it. But I did want to understand my own family members better because there's some real not nice people there.
They're not just jerks. Like they're not. I mean, they're assholes who murdered people. Is that right?
I mean, I've got my biological grandfather, the one that's still alive. He was in prison for a bit for white collar crime, and has just his whole life tried to do deals, but in a really sketchy way. And my other biological grandfather tried to murder his whole family once, so I wouldn't even be here. So there was that, which I found out quite recently after writing the book in a conversation with my mom, where genuinely this happened. I was like, there's this funny story by Dr. Fallon who was studying psychopaths, and he was looking at brain scans of psychopaths and non-psychopaths and sort of classifying psychopath, not psychopath, psychopath, not psychopath, and found he had a really high degree of accuracy, was holding up a brain, or an image of a brain, and said, definitely a psychopath. And it was his own brain. And he started going back in his family history and going, well, where does this brain come from? And so I asked my mom, I'm like, do we have any psychopaths in our family? And she's like, well... And when I asked her why I didn't know this, she's like, well, you never asked. You never asked if Grandpa came and tried to kill the whole family? That's not a question that you have. Anyway, go home and ask your family. You never know what you're going to find.
Now it's a question that all of us
It's not even
have.
in the book because it was after the book. Anyway.
Oh, it's terrible. But now you haven't, and your brain, do you know, I mean, the question that raises is whether your brain is... Yeah, have you checked your own brain?
I don't think so. So I think I'm really high on empathy. And I think this is actually what contributes to... You're like, I don't believe you.
I don't feel I have enough evidence. No, I guess I was just thinking, would psychopaths
know that they're psychopaths?
Do they know that they're psychopaths? Are they like, no, I can feel other people's fear when I threaten? I guess they can't. Is that right?
I mean, effectively, that is the answer to that question. Is when you hurt someone or when someone is in pain, do you feel pain? Effectively, it's the empathy question. It's one of the main... It's not the only question, but it's one of the main questions. And I think what leads me to write books like this, I've only written one like this, but what led me to write this book is that I have so much empathy that I feel like we need to constantly see the humanity in everybody, because I feel like that could be me really easily, and I find it really easy to put myself in other people's shoes, no matter what they've done. And that's a really scary thing to do, but I think it's really important.
So you think you could empathize with
literally anybody.
No, but part of what I wondered was whether you could empathize with that a psychopath would be like, oh, that murderer is just like a murderous asshole, and you'd be like, oh, I empathize with that. So you could empathize better with a murderer than a psychopath could, maybe.
Probably. I mean, there's a valid question. Could I empathize with psychopaths? Probably not, because they don't have empathy. So there's a disconnect there. Because we can't experience what it's like to have a completely different brain. But I think I can, understand sort of the context as to what might contribute to someone doing something terrible. And maybe I'm just particularly evil, or have it lurking there, and I just know it's there. But I think that we all kind of know that there's darkness inside us.
That's actually racist. When you say we all kind of know that, when we were talking just before, and you were talking about, you were talking about a conversation you were having this afternoon with someone where they were sort of shocked. You were because one of the things you talk about in the book is everybody has murderous fantasies, or not everybody, but a large percentage of people have murderous fantasies. And you were talking to someone who was what was can you describe that response?
It was on live radio, and she obviously hadn't,
secret, right.
And this isn't a negative. Lots of reporters don't have time to read books, and so they're sort of thrown into the situation where they're interview this person about evil, and of course, if you don't know the premise of the book, it's really hard to sort of navigate that.
Right.
And so I think she didn't really know what was coming, and that I am really keen on empathy exercises, that I'm really keen on making it personal and not just talking about extreme cases. It's not all about serial killers, it's about all of us. And that's sort of the whole point of my book. And I think she didn't see that coming. And so when I said that in research on murder fantasies, most people in these studies generally say that they have had a murder fantasy, at least one. And it's things like, and I said to her, it's things like, wanting to kill your boss. That's a really popular one. Just fantasizing about, not actually doing it, of course. I feel like you're particularly solemn now.
Almost everyone here is self-employed, so it's really creepy for them.
It's like you've been caught.
Everyone's self-employed except Kate, who works for me. So it's there's no winning in this situation.
I mean, I genuinely sometimes have audiences where I do this exercise where I'm like, close your eyes and like put your hand up if you've ever had a murder fantasy. And people are like before I've even finished the question, their hands are shooting up, and I'm like, I feel like I draw a particular kind of crowd. I was talking to her and I said, sort of gave these examples of, maybe wanting to kill your boss. That's a really popular one. Maybe a step parent, and also our siblings. Maybe. I mean, there's lots of targets, and it's usually this fantasy that we have. It's usually not long lasting. And she looked at me. Like, no way. And she effectively looked at me with also this level of fear. Like, she actually asked, she's like, have you ever had one? I'm like, oh yeah. Coffee shops. If you're there and you're making a lot of noise and I'm trying to work, I am definitely fantasizing about killing you. I mean, I keep it to myself, but still, it's there. Just know it's there. I mean, slow walkers is another one. And Leonard, so maybe not kill, but like trip really hard and like a bit of shot anyway. But she looked at me and sort of said, really, this is a get-to-know each other session. We're really going deep. But she looked at me as if I was crazy. But then,
that's
like 2 minutes later, she's like, oh, I fantasize about throwing my baby out the window. And I'm like, what? But it was only to my mom.
It's not murder. It's not murder if it's your own child. Is that the way?
You made it. You could take it. No. Anyway, I thought it was a fun disconnect.
Are there can we do just by show of hands? I'm not going to ask you to close your eyes because it seems weirder to close your eyes in a room full of murderers. But just like how many people, just by show of hands, how many people have like at times had fantasies about killing someone?
Hey.
How many people have not have fantasies about killing someone?
Weirdos.
Whoa! That is a different world than I thought it was. That's interesting.
Yeah, it is. So it's the same with things like cute aggression. Do you know what cute aggression is?
Yeah. So I've read the book, but maybe they haven't. So yeah.
So cute aggression keeps getting picked up because it's sort of my soft introduction to the book. I always, every chapter I try to start with sort of really relatable, small things.
Don't you open with Hitler?
But it's his brain and it's baby Hitler.
Okay, sorry.
But yeah, I mean, I do try to sort of, it very much escalates in every chapter, and that is by design, because I don't think I can throw you into empathize with serial killers before we've explored some sort of baby steps that get you there. And so cute aggression is one of my paths, and cute aggression is, that feeling, and some of you don't know this feeling, I've learned this, but most of you will. You see a cute animal, I just want to tear its little cheeks off. Maybe you have it with babies. I mean, everyone has their own weird version. I have it with my partner, Paul. I'm not sure if he thinks it's as cute as I do, but I definitely I'm just overwhelmed with this feeling of effectively affection, but it comes out in this sort of pseudo-aggressive way. It's like, why do I want to just slap him a little bit?
And you say some people have this and some people don't?
Yeah, and it's funny, the divide, because I'll be on a podcast and there'll be two people, and one person will be like, oh yeah, I have that all the time. I thought I was such a weirdo, because it feels wrong. It feels like a weird thing. And then the other person will be like, I've never even considered that. Which makes you feel really bad about yourself.
And what do you think? Is it people who just have a strong cuteness, like do they not have a strong cuteness sense, do you think? The people who lack cute aggression, or do they?
You're just cute
I don't have
deficient.
that feeling. I don't have that feeling, but it's pretty rare that I'm like overwhelmed by cuteness, And when I am, I just want to eat the thing. That's the thing. Which is
that's your version.
But like in a friendly way. I don't want to kill it. I just looks delicious. That's not abnormal.
You love Japan. Everything cute is edible. But yeah, it is weird. But it might be that you just don't have as much. You're right. It might be that you don't have as much of an overload, because effectively, according to research on this, the reason that we have that, it's the same reason why we laugh at a funeral. So we're laughing when we're supposed to be sad. Why we cry at a wedding. These are called dimorphous displays of emotion. And effectively, it's your brain trying to protect itself, or so one hypothesis goes, that you're shooting out so much of one emotion that your brain sort of goes the other way and says, I'm going to protect myself because you're going too far here. I don't want to burn out. And so it shoots out the opposite emotion. And so that's what those contradictory or seemingly contradictory emotions possibly come from.
Cool. All right. Well, there you go. So that's why. Now you know, according to one theory. So thank you.
And again, it doesn't mean you actually want to harm people or babies or animals. Although there was some fun research where people were popping bubbles and they're like, ah.
Where they were popping bubbles?
And what is that? Like in what's it called? Bubble wrap.
Yeah.
I mean, we love popping. I feel like some people.
Sure, that's
love bubble wrap
universal.
Anyway,
that's something that doesn't change. Yeah.
but yeah, apparently when you're watching cute animals on like on the internet, if you're given bubble wrap, you just lots of bubbles. If you have this cute aggression, and if you have a fluffy animal, it's actually worse. So if you've got your cat on your lap and you're looking at cute pictures online, be really careful. Because people were like throttling the stuffed animal and
Is
cuteness.
the idea that popping bubbles is a measurement for how aggressive people are?
Yeah, well, for frustration at the very least, or like an outlet for aggression.
wow.
You got to get creative with some of these psychology
Right, because
studies.
you can't, because of ethics.
Ethics, and also because asking people is actually quite difficult.
Right.
Because, how did you feel? 5 minutes later, already people may have forgotten or
Right.
not
But
rated
you can't
correctly.
go like pick a fight with them and see if they'll punch you, because that's
Correct.
You can't do that
Don't do
anymore.
that.
Because the golden
Yeah.
age is past.
Yes,
Right.
the golden
Okay.
age. The golden age of loose ethical controls
Yeah,
for
yeah.
studies.
So okay, here's what. So I want to talk about. This is the. I want to start talking about, like, I don't know. This is what I think the book is about, and you can tell me, or I think it is, because this is what you wrote. So, you talk about like having been interested in this stuff for so long, and you had this paragraph that. Well, here's what you write. You say, what I like most is destroying the fundamental conceptualizations of good and evil as black and white, replacing them with nuance and scientific insight. I want us all to have a more informed way of discussing behavior that we feel we cannot and should not begin to understand. Sorry, of discussing behavior that we feel like cannot and should not begin to understand. Without understanding, we risk dehumanizing others, writing off human beings because we don't comprehend them. We cannot and must try to understand that which we have labeled evil. So I kind of want to just know more about, like, I find that very compelling. And then I'm curious about, for you, like, what about that felt so important that you're like, oh, I want to write a whole, like, I want to devote all the time and energy and write a book about this? Like, what?
So it's a complicated question. I think the most simple answer is, I think genuinely the topics that I cover, I mean, it's sort of Julia's tour of evil, as my editor said once, like, only you would put these topics together in this way. And I think that's probably right. But I think, at least for me, these are the most important issues we as human beings can deal with right now. All of them in one book. Like, on a fundamental level of how we do harm to others, of how we treat other human beings, how we treat ourselves. I think I've tried to put together, in hopefully also a sort of fun way, but also in a quite hopefully sort of fundamentally, like, value-changing, belief-changing way, how we think about really tough issues that nobody really wants to talk about, but everyone kind of does. But we're not really brave enough often to talk about things like pedophilia, or, could I become a terrorist? Or, I mean, there's really deep questions that society just does this really big detour around, and we really need to be right head on in the middle of that and talking about those issues if we are to make the world a friendly and livable place, or even just to not go into atrocity repeatedly. So I think, for me, I could think of nothing, it sounds really pathetic, but nothing more important than talking about these issues, because I just think that I just feel like it's urgently needed, effectively.
Yeah, no, it doesn't sound pathetic. I mean, it doesn't sound like trivial to be like, oh, a person thinks the most important thing to talk about is evil in the world. It's like, no, that would make sense.
But it sounds a bit sort of self-aggrandizing, like, oh, I'm gonna cover this, and there are obviously other people who are covering it as well. But I don't find that most people are covering it in a personal way, and I think most people find the concept completely inaccessible.
So what do you think
that's problematic.
What do you think is missing? Like what made you think that there's something that's interesting when you're like, oh, like, other people aren't doing this? So what do you think that this book does? Like, what's missing in the conversations about evil that you feel like you're adding?
I think the first thing that's missing in the conversation is women's voices.
Unusual for one of the few conversations where that's the case.
I was talking to someone today, actually she's in the audience, and I was talking about the representation of women in nonfiction, and I was saying, sort of, I heard this statistic that 1 in 10 nonfiction books are written by women, and she's like, oh, yeah, it's more like 1 in 50 for most categories.
Whoa.
I mean, we are completely missing out of the conversation most of the time, and that is absolutely devastating. And so I feel like that's really important. Mm-hmm. And so it's going to be a different book.
And I noticed you quote a lot of women in the book too.
I do.
Right?
I do.
Yeah.
I do try to amplify women as well. I mean, there have been some notable figures like Hannah Arendt and Gitta Sereny, mostly from political philosophy, not so much from science, and certainly not recently. Yeah. But the other thing I think that isn't happening very much is genuinely don't think that most people make it really a personal journey. It's sort of like a book about psychopaths, and it effectively ends up with the reader, I think mostly, saying, oh, well, those psychopaths over there, they're the ones who are causing all the trouble. And it doesn't actually make you critically reflect on your own behavior and your own thoughts. And so I think it's really important to bring that back and make it, and frankly, make it more accessible, not just talk about philosophy, because I think we lose a lot of people in that conversation.
Right, so even if someone's writing a book about psychopaths, so one version is like they're writing a book about psychopaths and it's othering of them. Or even stuff, I'm thinking, because I feel like maybe someone write a book where they write about psychopaths and say like, well, we shouldn't other them. Mm-hmm. But what you're saying is you're making it more personal and more accessible than that. Is that
I'm
right?
certainly hoping to. And I'm also hoping to do a bigger breadth of topics. So I think there's a lot of focus on violence and there's a lot of focus on psychopaths. And if you will, traditionally male ideas. And I think that's where violence and psychopaths fit right in there. I think that's a male conceptualization of evil, potentially. I mean, I'm getting a bit feminist here, but that's who I am.
It's not going to be a super unpopular stance. Yeah.
That's a small clap. But I think it's important to broaden the topics that we're including in this conversation as well as the voices within it.
When you say those are specifically male topics, so you're saying like psychopaths are a male topic, male because more men are psychopaths, or because more men are interested in studying psychopaths, or
just the way that we so thinking about evil as violent crime, for example, or thinking about writing books on violent crime. Like, it's not to say that those aren't important topics. They are important topics, but I think they get a disproportionate amount of attention compared to other kinds of, even cybercrime doesn't, I think, get lumped in with evil often enough. I think that, corporate issues thinks about sort of, going with systems that are broken. Even things like cute aggression and aggression within a relationship sometimes get lost in this conversation when we jump right to the extreme. And I think that it can be, again, I think it's just about bringing other voices in who are probably going to have different focuses. And I do talk about things like Me Too, and I talk about, structural sexism. And I don't know that that's included in other books. I haven't seen it included in that way in other books on evil. One
of the things that I find myself thinking, and this is totally, I have all these notes where we're going to go through the thread of the book, and this is not at all in that at all.
We'll be here till tomorrow morning.
Yeah. But one thing that I wonder about when you said that thing about all these things about evil are from this male perspective, and I was like, yeah, well, I guess I guess most serial killers are men, and then I was like, well, corporate crime is mostly committed by men, and I was like, well, violent crime is mostly committed by men, and I was like, oh wait, what are the bad things that women do again? Like, is evil actually a male phenomenon? Like, is that another thing we have the monopoly on?
You just love being in charge. No, I would not say that men are. I don't think anyone's evil.
I understand. Yeah, but I want to come up with a phrase that describes it with not undoing. But like this, because one thing that I want to stress in the book too, and I think people are getting this from talking to you, but that I was worried about in presenting you, is that you think that the concept of evil is broken, but you care a lot about reducing harm. You're not a moral relativist. You're not you think there's stuff that people should and shouldn't do, and so I want maybe not to call it evil, but to say when we think about the kinds of harmful behaviors that humans engage in that we might want to see them do less of, it does seem like guys do a lot of do a disproportionate number of them.
So I published an article today on the disproportionate number of men in prisons, and saying that this is effectively almost a crisis, that we should really be concerned about the fact that there's so many men in prisons, and this is actually really harmful for men. Effectively, it was saying we should pay more attention and be more cautious and take more responsibility for how we socialize men, because we're really doing them disservice by the fact that they end up, effectively in cages disproportionately, which is terrible for everyone. And I ended up getting into quite a few Twitter, let's call them debates, with men's rights activists. And I was like, dudes, I'm on your side for this one. I'm specifically saying, let's talk about the men. I think it's really delicate it's a really delicate issue in terms of how we talk about men committing crime. Because it's easy to sort of say, look, men are committing crimes because they, for example, have so much more testosterone, and so it's natural that men commit more crime. Bullshit. That is not fair to men, because I would imagine you haven't committed any violent crimes recently.
Oh, not recently.
So, you're a man. You're sitting here with full of your testosterone.
Super testosterone-y. I am it's crazy, actually.
So crazy. and yet, perfectly peaceful, lovely human being. And I mean, so to blame testosterone is such a cop-out. And I think for society, we do sort of assume that, that's just how men are. And we need to be really, really careful with those kinds of assumptions and take more responsibility in how we, I think at least, how we socialize our boys. But where were we going with this?
The question that I started with, and then I just got excited by all the sort of variations of the answer, but I want to come back to the question a little bit, although I think we mostly got it, which is just like, why it's so important to, and I guess I'm getting it, like why it seems so important to you, and to really talk about this stuff. And well, I guess my question was why you wrote this book. And first it was because to make it personal and to make that personal connection. And part of it was then to have this kind of empathy. And then one thing that I'm getting from you that actually helps me understand the book better than I'd understood it was that you really think like we need to talk about all these things. That part of the problem we have in talking about evil, and I'm just saying it out loud because I feel like I want to get it, is that it's not just talking about evil in general. It's that because we're bad at talking about evil, we can't talk clearly about terrorism, we can't talk clearly about crime, and we can't talk clearly about pedophilia, and we can't talk clearly about racism, and we can't talk clearly about all these things. And that's a powerful idea that I hadn't quite gotten until you describe it, is that, and it's true, whenever we talk about any of these things, it's frustrating and it's hard. And it sounds like part of what you're saying, you correct me if I'm wrong, is that part of why it's frustrating and hard to talk about any of those things is that this idea of evil is woven into them.
Yeah, and they are really difficult issues to talk about. I mean, they cause a lot of harm to a lot of people, making sure that you respect also specifically victims in the conversation and make sure that you're not disenfranchising people who've maybe been directly affected by these kinds of situations and not just feeling like you're excusing bad behavior. I think, so I like to call it sort of empathy shaming. So you're at dinner with your family and you bring up a really difficult issue like terrorism, and your family's like, what are you trying to say? And effectively says, like, we are not even starting this conversation. And I think that's effectively shaming you out of having that discussion. And I think that's really, really harmful. And we do it to each other and ourselves all the time. And I think and the reason I don't think I attacked back the men's rights activists, but I think it's really important for me, too, to actually occasionally be like, okay, what do you think? Because it's really easy for me to just say, I don't want to talk to you because you're an asshole. I'm just pointing randomly.
And yet you found one. Sorry. She knows.
It's really easy to do that, right? To sort of say, you make me uncomfortable. I know that I fundamentally disagree with you on certain things that are really important to me. And to, instead of having any kind of meaningful conversation, just say, I'm never going to go there. And we'll never be able to understand each other that way or try to move forward.
Well, and just to be clear, when you're talking about understanding, like there's one level of understanding, which is like a dinner, the classic Thanksgiving conversation with like a parent who feels differently about terrorism than you do. But you're talking about something, but we're talking here broadly about something more extreme, which is not just being empathetic to, someone who feels differently about terrorism than you do, but you're talking about having that empathy with someone who's a terrorist, or someone who's a pedophile, or someone who's a racist, or someone who's in those kinds of categories. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think that, I think a fascinating question is, we could do another vote if you want, but like how many of you would sit next to decide to sit next to a known pedophile?
Wait, what's the context? Where?
Like,
what?
Good question. You're coming into this room. Someone has a label they wouldn't have. But let's presume you know that this person who is sitting here somewhere is a pedophile or has been shamed publicly for it as well. So it's like really public faced. You know that this is the case. Would you sit next to them? Who would sit next to that person?
Yeah.
Who wouldn't sit next to that person? So mostly wouldn't sit next to that person. And I think it's a good question. I feel like it shows how we keep our distance both socially and physically from people who we perceive to be, whether it's evil or at the very least capable of harm, even if it's not even that they're capable really of harming us in this context, because you're all adults, so probably, it's just a human being, and also lots of human beings can control their sexual urges. Yeah. And yet we don't even want to go near that person, never mind try to empathize with them or have a conversation with them.
Can I ask, just from one of the pedophile avoiders, why, just someone who didn't want to sit, yeah. Why didn't you want to sit next to, can someone just say, yeah?
Yeah.
I think because I'd be so angry.
Okay, yeah.
I'd just be so frustrated and angry.
So you'd be like,
worried they'd harm me.
Right.
The more that
So I'm not worried or angry, but it's just hard. It's not that I feel harmed, but I just feel it would make me too angry to sit next to them. Anyone else? Yeah.
If someone's done something that violates someone's boundaries, that does harm to someone who really cannot fight back to that extent, they've shown a certain regard for other people's boundaries, for other people's personhood, and I don't want to deal with it.
So do you feel threatened in that case? Or are you just like, I just want to shut them out of my world?
No, I just don't want to take on, I don't want to take on potential boundary pushing.
Right, so you're like, it might, so someone who would do that might do something that would push on my boundaries, and I don't want to have that around me. Is that fair?
No, it's not about my boundaries. It's that if you're a person who makes that trade of someone else's harm to your wants, I do not want that near me. That's not a good trade.
Does it matter now? One thing I know that you talk about in your book is there's different. Initially, I wasn't so inclined to talk about the specific examples, but you've persuaded me that I want to talk more about them by talking about like the importance of it, which is interesting. And one of the things you talk about in the book is that there's different kinds of ways of being a pedophile, right? So, and are people. One of the things we were going to say before we had this talk, we were like, do we need to have like a trigger warning before this talk? And I think your feeling was like, it's a book called Evil, and like it says like there's chapters about terrorism and pedophilia and murder and violence. So I hope that this is okay for people, and if it's not, I apologize, which is not as good as having warned you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like a walking trigger warning. I pretty much only talk about taboo issues.
There's nothing there's no topic in this book that isn't upsetting to quite a lot of people. So
yes. I'm actually amazed I don't have more trolls. I mean, the sort of men's rights activists are like, that's kind of cute, but like, there's some really difficult issues in this book that haven't had the backlash that I was kind of expecting. And pedophilia specifically has been a really interesting response because genuinely, so first of all, I didn't go out to write a chapter on pedophiles. That was not the goal. It was just that there is so much to talk about because there are so many misconceptions, and this concept of pedophilia is linked so deeply with our understanding of evil that it requires its own space. It's also really difficult to talk about it right next to other kinds of sexual fetishes. So the chapter before talks about like BDSM, it talks about pushing boundaries, it talks about LGBTQI issues, and sort of how that's linked with evil in various ways, and what actually is normal in those contexts, and at what point, I mean, it goes up to zoophilia, so it goes all the way. If you don't know what zoophilia is, you'll learn in the book.
You can guess.
You haven't gone too dark into the internet.
Who's in the zoo, that you might have sex with,
Good point. Although not typically, it doesn't actually happen in zoos very often.
I would imagine that's one of the few advantages of being in the zoo is that you're safe from zoophilia, paradoxically.
So I get to zoophiles, and then I move into pedophiles completely separately because it's totally different when we're talking about, consenting adults, certainly, whether animals can consent. There's a whole interesting conversation there.
That was a wild that was the most that was the most surprising chapter and the most surprising section.
Ooh.
Yeah.
The kinky as fuck chapter, or star. It's like I censored myself. The pedophiles chapter. Why did I write a chapter on pedophiles? It's an incredibly important issue that I think we don't talk about really at all. I think we label a lot of people pedophiles, especially in headlines, who aren't. And this is the first disambiguation, is that pedophilia is a primary or exclusive sexual attraction to children under the age of puberty. So usually under the age of about 11. And really, even within people who are sexually attracted predominantly to children, that is a small group. And then there's ephebophiles, who are in the middle, who are attracted to pubescent children. And then there's hebophiles, who are attracted to effectively people who are mature in terms of their sexuality, in terms of having hit puberty, but aren't yet adults. So they can't consent legally, and that's the sort of 13, 14 to 18 range. Now, I think we can all agree intuitively that, let's say, a 25-year-old having sex with a 16-year-old who claims she or he is consenting is fundamentally different than a 25-year-old having sex with a 5-year-old. That is a completely different situation. Yet, when we look at headlines and when we look at the way people talk about pedophilia, they are almost always using the word to refer to people in that other category, in that teenage category. And that's really damaging, and it's really it makes things really fuzzy in terms of how we actually treat individuals, because there's a vastly different prognosis for people who are actually pedophiles and people who have other related diagnoses. It's much more damning if you are a pedophile. And also...
The heartbreaking one.
Yeah.
The one that's heartbreaking for me is the failure to disambiguate between people who act on the urges and people who have the urges and don't act on them.
Right.
And that, like, kills me.
Yeah. So that's the other thing, is that, well, for one, a lot of people who, this is a bit triggering, so could be, but for a lot of people who end up sexually abusing children, they do not have a primary interest in young people. So most 25-year-olds who are having sex with 16 or 15-year-olds are not predominantly attracted to 15 or 16-year-olds. They're just easier targets. And so we need to also be very careful that we're not mixing up predatory behavior with a primary or exclusive sexual interest. And so those are the same people who are also more likely to sexually assault same-age peers if the chances arise. So that's not about it's not about a sexual preference. That's more about predatory behavior.
Yeah.
And most people...
And that's differently heartbreaking.
It is differently heartbreaking. And that takes us to the other one, which is the one that we almost don't talk about at all, which is that most people... And so if you look at some statistics, some really prominent researchers in this area say that about 2% of men say that they have some sexual interest in children or people under the age of 18. That's a lot of people. Like, you almost certainly know someone who has watched child pornography or at least thinks about it sometimes and has this like bit of them. But then there's the sort of, and this is where we get into, and so as soon as you watch child pornography, you've taken it to the next level. But most of these people never engage in anything that actually does harm to a child. And this is what we need to understand, is that just because you have a sexual proclivity, it doesn't mean you're acting on it.
Yeah. And that's the part that breaks my heart. Like that label of pedophile. And also, you can go to jail for that. Like you can go to jail. Like if you someone who in my broad circle of acquaintance, someone to whom this happened, which is part of why it's particular. That someone who what they did was like they were writing erotic short stories about children and posting them to an online forum where other people who like to read erotic short stories for children would read them. And if you do that, you're a pedophile. And I'm sure the opinion of the movement is divided. Like some people are like, well, that's just monstrous behavior. But I think about that person, and I'm assuming, I don't know what this person's behavior was, but I assume there are some people who have those urges and don't act on them. And I'm like, you have this sexuality that you did not choose, which you know is terrible. You spend your whole life not acting on these urges. And then when someone finds out that you've been doing that, what happens is you go to jail and you're a monster for your whole life. And it's so, to me, that's so upsetting. Like people don't choose to, don't choose to have those desires. Yeah,
exactly. So I think, and this is where it's really critical that we have a conversation about risk reduction, about harm reduction. Yeah. Because and there are real questions around things like hentai, so like animated porn. Is that okay? Fake children, so like robots or sex toys that emulate children. I know this. A lot of people in this room are going, oh, but is that harm reducing or not? And we don't actually have the answer.
And those questions, I guess, are empirical questions. Like that's for you as a psychologist.
Really hard to study because for one, it's really like effectively as soon as so in Canada, for example, there's effectively nowhere to go if you have urges like this. If you go to a normal psychologist, they have to report you because you might be a danger to children. And so you're pretty much on your own and maybe in some online forums. And that is simply not good enough. And so we need to figure out, and there's some places like Germany has one stream of therapy where you can go and actually talk about this and get help to make sure that you don't become an offending pedophile. But most countries completely lack an infrastructure that can support people so that they don't act on these urges.
And that's because, and that feels like this ties in with what I see as like the central theme of the book kind of coming up in these different ways, where it's like, oh, like the fact that what we do with these people is villainize them. We villainize them so badly that it makes it impossible for them to
get help. Yeah.
And so that the label of evil and the and villainizing people, which I guess which is the same thing, calling people evil, arguably in this case, we're not sure, but arguably increases the harm in the world. Is that?
Labeling people evil? Yeah, certainly. I think so. And dehumanizing people in general, I think, leads us to the worst things that humanity has done. and continues to do. And so dehumanizing in the UK, for example, there was a study that I talk about in the book as well, where most people, there's already a lot of people, unfortunately, who would quite like the death penalty back for certain kinds of crime. But specifically, the crime that they mention when you ask them is for pedophilia or for convicted child sex offenders. And it's sort of this idea of like, just kill them. What? That is it's so beyond any feasible human way of dealing with this kind of situation, to me, at least.
Why? That's interesting, because to me, I agree with you. I'm against the death penalty, but I'm not sure that I see how the one follows from the other. Like, I'm not sure that I get it.
In what sense?
Well, like I can see saying like, oh, because punishments serve a bunch of functions, right? Like, so one punishment, one is to punish people, to punish bad people. That's the one where it's evil, right? That guy's evil. He's a bad person, so bad things should happen to bad people. Let's put him in jail. He'll suffer. That's good, because bad people should suffer. But another reason you put people in jail is to say, well, we put people in jail as a deterrent, or we put people in jail because we don't want them around. So I can see. I can begin to imagine someone saying, no, but I can imagine the argument. And again, I'm totally against the death penalty. It's a terrible idea. But I can imagine the argument, even without evil, to say like, oh, the thing about pedophilia is it's so bad, that when people do it, we have to give them the death penalty, A, as a deterrent to future people doing it, and B, because we really just don't want them around at all anymore. But
when we're talking about 2% of the population, that's a lot of guys who, and it's just not in any way a feasible way of dealing with it. But I think it shows the strong emotions that are attached to this idea. And effectively, in my view, we have two choices. One is, do we want to not talk about it and continue to label them as evil, or do we want our kids to be safe? That's it.
Wow, okay. That's interesting. So it's really, that really is like that.
Right now, there are just a lot of people who are at risk who really, I think, don't need to be at risk because we're not brave enough to talk about it.
And that's because of the general problem, like the specific stuff around pedophilia, but also the general problem of not being able to talk about evil.
Right.
That's awesome. Okay. That's really interesting.
You guys are so quiet.
So sorry? Yeah, that really does. I see why you lead
really
with
serious.
the cute aggression stuff. And now so I want to think about that. I want to think about that bolder claim. So I talked about you talk about that general idea that like we must be able to talk about this stuff more clearly and more openly. And again, I'm sort of understanding that more as we talk about it more, which I'm finding really helpful. You also make this even bolder claim, which is this or like I guess it is a bolder claim, which is you say like, I think neither humans nor actions should be labeled evil. So that's like, I feel like that's like the really big, bold claim of the book. And so I'm curious, like, tell me, again, I feel like we've touched on it, but I'd like to hear you like articulate, like, what's the reasons for that? Like, what are the reasons for that?
For one, it's something you can do. I think there's lots of things that you, and me as well, as writing this book, it's really easy to sort of think, man, the world's a fucked up place.
Yeah.
And to really get sunk into a dark place where you feel totally like there's nothing you can do to fight all of these different streams of bad behavior. And I think that stopping to use the word evil and challenging people when they use it is something that's a really practical thing you can do right away. So you can at the very least start breaking down, asking things like, if someone used the word evil, what do you mean by that? Because you'd be surprised by how difficult it is for people to explain what they're actually talking about. What part of this behavior or this person are you actually referring to? And is it universally the case that you would label it evil? And almost always the case is no. And so you like things like aggression. Obviously, it's not always evil. Well, violence also not always evil. Well, what about, and so you get into this sort of much better discussion, and rather than dehumanizing others,
you talk about it being lazy. Like that's one thing. So it feels lazy. It's like just kind of like,
yeah, it's the end of a conversation.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't be.
That's something that connects with, like, when I think about how this work connects with the work that I do, like teaching people to communicate better. It's one of the like basic things we teach people in the class is like, if your goal is to try to understand the other person or be empathetic, and most people, like, that's what they say. They say, oh, when I communicate with my, I say, what do you want to be like? And practically everyone says, I want to be empathetic, I want to listen to people, I want to understand people, that's what I'm like. But then no one actually does it when they get stressed out. They do the opposite, and that's why they have to take a class. That's my pitch. But one of the signs that there's sort of signs for people that they've shut down, and one of the big signs is that when you start to think that the other person's evil, Like once you say like, oh, why are they doing that? And you say, oh, because they're a bad person. Or even in the stuff that we do, it's not as big, but like evil also has these sort of like smaller scale synonyms. It's because they're a jerk or because they're an asshole, which to me means kind of like they're a little bit evil, because they're, that those kinds of things. And it's and what we always say in the class is like, what that means is your curiosity is shut down. You're now no longer learning anything. And I'm not sure if that's tied in with the laziness that you're talking about.
And you're no longer willing to actually have a real discussion with this person or try to figure them out. And I think, you're absolutely right that we have variations of that. And what we're doing is, the basic sort of psychology introductory class on this would say, you're making a fundamental attribution error.
Right.
Which means that you're taking a situation or a behavior and you're saying, this is what this person is. This is who they are, rather than this is how they're behaving right now, or this is how they're behaving towards me. And that's just not an effective strategy for most situations.
When you say that who they are thing, it raises that lovely thing that you have in the book. I think that's the empathy exercise, right? Is that can you just describe that? Because I love that. That's such like a nice thing in the book. The
think about the worst thing you've ever done.
Yeah. So just
ready? So it's effectively, so do we want to close our eyes? Are we doing that? No. Close your eyes. Let's do it. We're doing it. Close your eyes. Now think about the worst thing you've ever done. Whether it's maybe cheating on a partner, maybe it's lying about something important, maybe it's hurting someone physically or emotionally. Now picture that everybody in your immediate friend group and family group knew about it and called you names and only associated you with this term. How would that make you feel? You can open your eyes. Would you feel terrible? Do you think it would capture you as a complex human being? Do you think it would be a fair assessment of your character? I hope not. So when I think about the worst things I've ever done, which I'm not going to share with you right now, I definitely, if I had that tattooed on my forehead, if that is the main thing people knew about me, which is what we do with offenders quite often. Like we call them a murderer because they've murdered, or we call them a cheater, or we call them a thief. That's...
I kept thinking about this on the way over. Like I was like, sometimes me and my wife get in a fight, and I yell at her. I've done worse things than this, but this is like the example that I'm using is like something bad that I do. And I picture coming here and people being like, people like, oh yeah, you go to the event? That noted wife yeller Misha Glouberman is going to be hosting an event. You'd be like, do you want to go to that? Like, oh yeah, what's wife yeller Misha Glouberman doing this week? And then they're like maybe watching, someone got a video and they're like, well, yeah, just got a video of him yelling at his wife. Like, yeah, I don't know about that guy. And like you say, I'm a sweetheart, but but still, once in a while I'm not. And the idea of like that became, and you say, you make that case about murderers, which is so interesting about murderers that like we think about, like some murderer, but you're like most of them they murdered one person once, right? Like that's
not to excuse this behavior.
I murder one person. Everyone's like, oh, blah blah blah.
Murder. Not to excuse the behavior. Do they call me the
parallel parker? I parallel park like every day. No, but I understand it's important. I'm not saying it's important.
Yes.
But at the same time, when we think of that person who's a murderer, what we think of them as, and that's the fundamental. I guess something different than that. But we think of them as this person who's like just walking around all the time with a knife. Yeah, but they're not, right?
No, they're normal human beings, and most people only ever murder one person. Most people never murder anyone, but if they do murder someone, it's once, and almost all of them regret it almost immediately.
Which is really interesting.
So they're not sort of the murders we see on TV, right? They're not sort of planning for weeks to finally have their comeuppance. Like this doesn't happen. It's really, really, really rare that we see those kinds of real depictions of what actually causes most or leads to most murder. We don't see those on TV because they're boring stories.
Which is what?
Which is, getting in a fight over, I was looking at the research on sort of reasons that are given, and the most common one is a conflict that gets out of control. And so that, it's so banal. So one of the reasons given was got in a fight over $4.
But that conflict part's really important too, right? So the other person usually isn't, they're not just, again, when we picture a murderer, we also picture their victim as innocent.
Right.
But usually what happens, I think, is that it's a fight. It's like two people got in a fight, and both people were being in a fight, and both people were being aggressive, and they're escalatingly aggressive until one person goes so far that they kill the other person, and then they're like, oh my God, what have I done?
Exactly.
That's what murder actually is, which is astounding because it's not the picture we have in our mind of murder at all. at all.
Which is why I would presume that most people who end up killing somebody would have assumed that they are not capable of murder.
Right.
And then they end up doing, and this is why, again, it's so important to have these hypothetical exercises to think about sort of what's in us all, to try and deal with making sure they're making better decisions in those kinds of heated moments.
Yeah, and to understand that it's not, and I think that's the thing, that idea that the evil people are these people who are just qualitatively different from us, right?
Which
and that seems
they're just not.
Right, and that seems like another reason why it's important to talk about this stuff. And you talk about that too. Like just understanding that it's not a difference of kind or whatever.
Yeah.
So you think we're all capable of these things, is that right?
I think we are all capable of most human atrocity. I also think that it is prudent to assume that we are. So it also doesn't mean that we're all equally likely to, for example, murder someone. That is not what I'm saying. There are definitely factors that make it significantly more likely for you to do harm to others. But I think that you have to assume that you're capable of the worst possible crimes, and you can't just look at others and say, I can't even begin to empathize. And this is, war-torn countries are the perfect example of perfectly normal people doing heinous things to one another really quite quickly. You can turn from good person to what you would even consider potentially, maybe not in the moment, but certainly before or after, doing morally reprehensible things. And that this happens all the time. And so I think we need to constantly, especially when things are good, like right now in Canada, we're mostly safe, there's no war here. Now is the time. It's like a squirrel. Like you need to be collecting your nuts. Except the nuts are hypothetical moral dilemmas. But you're collecting your hypothetical moral dilemmas and your conversations around evil now, because now you have the capacity to actually think about them. And so when the situation comes, you're kind of ready. And you're not as easily lured into really terrible behavior.
And at the same time, that also, so I like that. And at the same time, part of it is I'm not sure that maybe we're just lured into different terrible behaviors. So one of the things that it brought to mind for me was you give that example in your book where you say, somewhere out there in the world thinks you're evil.
Yeah.
Right? So what were some of the, you want to talk about
why?
Well, I guess, so you had a bunch of examples. You were someone thinks, I forget what your examples were. Do you want to
Yeah, one of them is, you're living out of wedlock and you're having sex with your partner. If you're on the spectrum of LGBTQI behavior, depending on what your relationship status is right now, it might be illegal or warrant the death penalty in other countries. Never mind crossing religious boundaries, that we also know that a lot of non-heteronormative behavior goes into. So I'm definitely considered evil,
right.
For various reasons. If you're a banker, right? I feel like that's just enough said. What are your priorities like? I feel like the bankers are in that corner because you didn't laugh.
The bankers came to the event on evil and they're so disappointed.
Finances
they thought
over
it was just going to be
there.
instructional.
There is research showing that there's a disproportionate number of psychopaths in business schools, but that's another conversation.
I guess the thing I was curious about that thing about when I read that in the book, and I was like, there's people who think I'm evil, and to me there was a really important dividing line between those people, because there's a lot of people who think I'm evil. There's people who think I'm evil because I lived with a partner I wasn't married with, and whatever, and I'm like, yeah, whatever. Or there's people who think I'm evil because I don't know, because I eat
meat?
Pork. Well,
yeah.
But meat, no. But you see, those people I think are right, and I was like, okay, so the people I'm concerned about aren't the people who think I'm evil and they're wrong. I'm cool with those people. I'm concerned with the people who think I'm evil and they're right.
Yeah.
Mostly where those people live, in my mind, is in the future. So I'm always I always think about, when we go back in time and we're
There's any vegans in here? You're the future?
Yeah, the vegans are so you go back in time.
There's no vegans in here. So you guys, especially over here, we're still back to the bankers. They're like, no, also not.
So one place that's full of evil people, it turns out, is the past. There's all these people in the past who are they were racist and they were sexist and they owned slaves and they were way more violent and tolerance of violence. They were just terrible in all these ways. And I'm like, man, those people sure were shitty. But then I think about me and I have this imagined conversation. And there's a million conversations. Eating meat is one of them, but there's lots of them where I just picture someone, 50 years down the road being like, hey, grandpa, they'll call me grandpa because that's an affectionate nickname. They'll be like, hey, gramps. They'll be like, so did you eat meat back in the 2018? I was, oh, yeah, I did. And they'd be like, oh, so I guess you didn't know it was wrong. No, we kind of knew. Oh, but that's before people knew about factory farming. No, I knew about factory farming. Oh, okay, so you avoided factory farm animals.
No.
I kind of thought about it, but well, why not? Everyone else kind of was doing it, and it was okay. And I feel there's like that's one, but I feel there's a few things we can do that with. And it's kind of, on the one hand, it's really upsetting, but it's also helpful in that empathy thing of being like, when we be like, well, how could those horrible, how could the founding fathers have all owned slaves? Like, and it's like, well, I think kind of in the same way, And,
yeah, and there's a whole, I have a chapter on it, right, of how also money changes our morality and acts as a buffer between us and the things we consume, for example. And the meat paradox is one of the things I talk about, is that I'm also not vegan. I try to live more plant-based, but that's a cop-out. It's still good, but it is not enough. And more importantly, I think that things like global warming is obviously a massive issue, and we are totally messing with the future for any future humanoids. And we're doing it all the time. The fact that I flew here in an aircraft with jet fuel, and I do it all the time, I can sort of sit at home and feel really happy about the fact, I don't have a car. It's overly negated by my amount of flying. And it's really easy for us to feel like good people because of the few good things that we do. And I'm having a non-dairy yogurt right now. That is not sufficient. And effectively, it's sort of just pandering to that little person, that little moral compass inside us that says, you should be doing this, but then we break it all the time. And that hypocrisy I find really interesting.
Yeah, and that story, and also that story that we're the good guys. And that feels really important too. Like that idea that, one of the things that I think more, reading your book and others, is that idea that that the idea of evil, if you start to take it apart, you can sort of say it's sort of lazy. And once you start to take it apart, it doesn't even bear scrutiny in some sort of ways. And I think that one of the ways is that our fantasy, our real fantasies of evil are these people who are just these bad guys. And they kind of know that they're the bad guys. And so if we don't think we're and I know it's fiction, but think about Darth Vader, like those kinds of, I think that ties in a lot of our ideas about evil.
Every time I want to say the title of my book, something dark side.
Yeah,
every
right?
time.
So Darth Vader, he's come to the dark side, Luke, and he's he knows he's evil. His house is called the Death Star. He's not under any. He's not a freedom. He's not a terrorist who thinks he's a freedom fighter. He knows he's the bad guy. And I think so many. I have a kid now, and
that's a quick transition from Darth Vader to your child.
And I am trying to bring him to the dark side. Well, you'll see where I'm going
terrible
with this.
Terrible twos. Where are we?
That kid is evil. Let me tell you. I'm going somewhere nice with this. Which is that watching that stuff be kind of when you think about what you actually look at what children learn, what do we instruct in them? Basically, what we teach them is the names of animals. And that the world is divided into good guys and bad guys. Those are the two central lessons that they learn, neither of which are useful lessons because he's not going to have to name a lot of animals. But more importantly, because I think with you that the idea that the world is divided into good guys and bad guys is one of the most destructive and dangerous ideas. And yet practically every piece of children's fiction, not a huge number of them are, there's the Wicked Witch of the West, her name is the Wicked Witch of the West. She knows. It's such a weird image of how good and evil works.
They're always sadists too. They're
they're sadists, and also, and I think this is part of the idea of evil that's also so sad for me. Yeah, they're sadists. They're purely evil. We are purely good, and also we have license to delight in their suffering, which is really weird, right? If you were to look at earthling entertainment, you'd be what they like to do is watch people get killed in movies, but it's okay because they're all bad guys.
And if you go back to the past, public hangings, there's lots of levels of that we have long sort of taken pleasure in the suffering, the extreme suffering of others, especially people we perceive as bad.
Almost, I would say probably, do we ever take pleasure in the suffering of people we don't think of as bad?
It's a good question. Probably not.
So that's to me seems like the thing about evil that's so dangerous. That to me what evil is evil is almost this word that we use to allow ourselves to delight in the suffering of others, right? That it's and I don't know if does that make sense?
Yeah, and that touches on the sort of one of that central tenets of the book, which is this sort of dehumanizing that happens when we use this label. And this is what I'm so worried about, is that I think genuinely, if you were to believe in a concept of evil, I think that using that label effectively makes you more likely to be evil. So I think that in using this term, you are justifying really bad behavior, and you're saying exactly this, they're terrorists, and so it's totally fine to torture them, or they're, and this is where we also get into othering in different ways, is sort of the sort of Trump argument of like Mexicans are all rapists coming over the border, so I'm going to build a wall and I'm going to treat them subhuman. I mean, there's like we use this rhetoric in lots of different ways, and they can get into really harsh cases of xenophobia and isolationism. And I think that it allows political leaders, but it also allows individuals to justify incredibly harmful behavior.
And I wonder about that. Like, I wonder if we think about like all the harm that humans have done to each other in the world, like what percentage of it has been done with the excuse of those people are evil?
Yeah, there's a really good Kurt Vonnegut quote on this, which is that effectively we delight in the suffering and we assume that we have God on our side.
Right.
And so sort of this idea that the evil one is someone else, and we're the ones with God on our side. And so when we do something harmful to them, we're in the right. And I can't remember the verbatim quote now, but it's a really good quote. And it's actually hidden in the book. It's that part of every man.
How it's hidden how? It's
so I learned this word when I tweeted about this. And I started saying, in every book I hide a Kurt Vonnegut quote from Mother Night. He's one of my favorite authors. It was one of my sort of foundational books. And so I learned the word acrostics. Who here knows what acrostics are?
Yeah, like that.
Oh, disproportionate number of you. Now I feel like an idiot.
It's a cool crowd you attract.
It's a cool crowd. So I do paragraph acrostics. So I effectively hide the sentence across as the first word of consecutive paragraphs. It's really hard to find if you don't know where it is or what it is. But I delight in making it difficult for you guys. But it's there, and so it's that part of every man that delights in sort of.
Who else does stuff like that? Villains, super villains. That's like the Riddler does shit like that, like you and the Riddler. So.
Just sitting in my Death Star.
Yeah, just to make it clear. Good guys don't encrypt messages into things like that.
In my first book, in The Memory Illusion, I actually put it in a part of a chapter on subliminal messages, which just gave me this nice. Delight.
That's good. Yeah, that's awesome.
There's a subliminal message in there.
I've got so many things I want to ask you. You know what? I see people like we're going to open it up for questions. So I'm going to take some questions. Does anyone have any questions? Anyone who's not me have any questions? I didn't warn you I was going to do this, so.
Can we have questions from up there? I feel like I can barely see you, but I love that you're on a balcony.
You want questions from the people on the balcony just because they're
like you're Juliet and
elevated?
I'm Romeo. That's the way around, right?
So only people on the balcony or the groundlings are welcome. Welcome. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
Kind of a broad question. You were talking about the grayscale of evil and good, but in terms of the inherent nature, in terms of researching this and going through psychology, do you find the inherent nature of humans selfish, of like we suppress the idea of like we want to kick the slow walkers or squeeze the cute hamster, like we have to actively become good, or do you think it's a sliding scale?
So I reject both the idea of good and evil. But
cool.
Boom, done. But I think that I'm not sure suppression is the right word for it, but I do think that it's difficult for us to think of ourselves in a more complex. I mean, complexity is hard, just in general, for the brain. The brain does not like complexity, whether it's about our own thoughts and behaviors or others. And so I think we do need to override, let's say, some of our more basal instincts, our more animal instincts, where we try to sort of divide people into good and evil, but also where we when we like act out on our aggression. I mean, that is also a way of self-control, right? I mean, it's the same idea. Like you have self-control how you think about the world, but you also have self-control in how you behave. So I don't think we're suppressing it. I don't think sort of humans are inherently good or evil and sort of just lurking there. I just think we're a complex. There's a great book called, I think you'll find it's more complicated than that. But effectively, it's this complex mix of things. But yeah, I think.
Does that answer your question?
I don't know.
Okay, you seem so satisfied. All right, yes, you over there. Yes, you, ma'am.
Do you look at the concept of narcissism?
I do.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Tell us about narcissism.
Narcissism, my favorite test in the book. I do quite a lot of quizzes. You can test if you're creepy, for example. I think it's one of the like core questions of the universe. Like, do creepy people know they're creepy? Like when we've answered that, we'll know a lot more. No. But narcissism, I talk about creepiness, I talk about psychopathy. The single item narcissism scale is one of my favorite things in psychology. So psychologists are trying to figure out how do we measure narcissism, and so they come up with this battery of battery of questions, or as we call in psychology, they came up with an instrument a questionnaire, and people were taking this, and they're like, okay, well, we need to shorten it, and then so they tried to shorten it, and someone said one day, I'm like, I have an idea. Why don't we shorten it to this one question? And the one question, which ended up being highly predictive of whether someone is actually a narcissist, is, are you a narcissist? My favorite and possibly the shortest psych test. And the reason, the argument, the researchers claim for why it works is that narcissists are quite often quite proud that they're narcissists. So obviously I'm awesome. I should feel good about myself. So I think, yes, I do touch on this. I also touch on the fact that not all narcissism is bad. So I think we overuse this term, just like I talk about not all psychopathy leads to crime. And I think we have a tendency to say narcissism is bad, and there's sort of this like pointing at millennials and saying, oh, you guys with your social media, you're all just taking pictures of yourselves. You must be such narcissists. And that's not necessarily, I mean, I think every millennial will go, well, that's not going to obviously capture our actual experience. And when you look at research on it, there's two types of narcissism. And one of them is effectively actually thinking that, I have things to share and I'm pretty cool, which is a healthy type of narcissism ultimately. It's like not too far from self-love, which sort of goes towards the sort of mindfulness, like self-care. Like it's not far from that. It's still annoying for other people maybe, but it's not toxic. Then there's the other version, which is a more toxic type, which is coming from a place of insecurity, which is coming from almost a fear or an anger, and you're sort of overcompensating. And that's, I think, what we assume all narcissism is, but it's not. And so we need to be careful in how we talk about it, because that is much more likely to cause harm to others, and those individuals are much more likely to be destructive, and the others pretty much just don't. So yes, I do talk about it, and there's more about the dark triad and the dark tetrad in there, if you're more interested in those concepts.
There you go, great. Over there, yes, you.
So we have a federal election coming in Canada very soon, and it will be a different election from others because we're seeing a rise in xenophobic, racist rhetoric, a yellow vest movement led by those impulses and people like Faith Goldie and...
Is there a yellow vest movement here?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, I missed that. I'm too focused on Europe.
Yeah.
Okay.
So progressives tend to label people in those movements as racist and diminish their humanity by just discrediting them by not trying to understand or empathize with what they're feeling. Mm-hmm. So based on what you're saying, I'm curious about what your, I guess your advice would be to how to inoculate ourselves in an election or as a society from the forces of xenophobia and hate by not labeling people.
So I just want to repeat the question. Do people hear it back there okay? Okay, so I want both of you can hear it and also for the recording. So the question, and tell me if I have this right. If I have it wrong, I'll try again. But the basic idea is like as we come into the federal election in Canada and dealing with some of the racist and xenophobic forces that are frightening forces in the country and in the world, how do, as progressive people, we want to deal with those forces and not accept them and try to diminish their impact. But the question is there a way to do this without, but our inclination is to, the inclination among progressives is to label those people as racist and therefore evil and whatever. And the question is there a way to counteract their impact without othering them by calling them evil? Is that a fair summary? Did I miss anything? You seem okay. Good.
How do we protect ourselves against a rise in xenophobia and also polarization, I guess, of
But specifically,
groups?
the part that I wanted to get at, which I think you were asking, was like not how do we stop them, but how do we stop ourselves from labeling them as evil, or should we? Is that fair? Okay, all right.
I think it is one of the most important questions of our time, so well done. That's patronizing, sorry. But yeah, genuinely, I think that me included, have a tendency to think, again, that we have God on our side. I'm not a godly person, but to think that we're in the right and that people who don't think like us are wrong. And they're bad, and they're evil. And we use words, Trump as described as evil. Politicians have long been described as evil, but Trump specifically is described as evil and infantile so often that I think it is really destructive to any kind of meaningful conversation around how do we actually deal with these attitudes and not just say, oh, well, he's, again, sort of this odd one out. And I think that you're absolutely right, that the first thing you need to do is to acknowledge that other opinions also matter, even if you don't agree with them. And that probably, I think specifically things like xenophobia, come from a place of fear and anger. And that anger is in itself justified. It's just pointing at the wrong source. So I think that there are a lot of people who are and this is getting a bit structural, and I do not talk about this in the book, but I think it's genuinely like there are the losers of capitalism ultimately. And I think there are a lot of people who are losing in a system that they feel they deserve more because we've told them that they do. We've told them that if you live in Canada, this is what you're supposed to get. And if you don't get those things, if you don't have a structure, if you don't have a stable job, if you don't have the right education, if your industry has tanked, if there's so many reasons why you might be a have-not in our society that have nothing to do with how good you are as a person. And so instead of blaming structure, instead of saying this is a structure that cannot have everyone winning, because again, the structure likes to preserve itself, you look for a reason. And what easier reason than the newcomers? Because you also often live in this world of nostalgia, of how maybe Canada has always been strong and proud and great. I mean, make America great again, make Britain great again. Those campaigns worked for a reason. And it's because people have this nostalgia where they look back and think, well, we are a proud and great nation. And so it can't be us. It can't be our systems. It has to be something else. And I think it's really easy to point at immigrants and say, that's the problem. And so we need to make sure that we're acknowledging the fundamental discrepancies and the fear and the anger and try to have a conversation about the other sources that might come from and direct it, ideally, away from the newcomers and towards other potential real sources.
Do you think there's Do you think there's a similar danger of pointing fingers at Trump supporters in that way? Then when you say like, why are things going so badly, and why is political discourse so broken and messed up, and just sort of say, oh, because those people are shitty and those people are evil, and that.
Yeah, other popular sort of scapegoats right now, if you will, or sort of things that we point at are echo chambers. We point at fake news. We point at lots of things
baskets of deplorables, like feels like that kind of thing.
Feels like
those
cheating.
people are just all terrible.
Right? Yeah, those things are all terrible, and they all feel like they're threatening democracy, and they're sort of. But the reason they work, and the reason not they work, I mean, how much role of fake news actually played is, I mean, especially recently, has been sort of contested. Like, no, maybe it actually didn't influence that many people. Maybe not as many people sort of voted a certain way because they were exposed to fake news. That's probably not enough of an explanation. And the bigger question is, even if they were, and even if it did work, why did it work? And it's because it plays into people's fears. And so again, it's about addressing the structural injustices and trying to, but it's unfortunately not an easy fix. And it's much easier for someone to promise. I mean, I'm in the UK. I mean, Brexit, are you fucking kidding me? I mean, it is a circus right now. Nobody knows what's going on. And it's really bizarre, the situations we can find ourselves in when we're not engaging, I think. And there as well, like, and nobody thought it was going to happen. I mean, a lot of people thought it wasn't going to happen, and so we're totally underprepared.
Does that answer your question? Does it get at what you're doing? I see a big happy thumbs up. There's scapegoating in general, whether it's scapegoating of the immigrants or scapegoating of the. Okay, does that? Okay, great. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to go to the back of the room. Yes, the back of the room. Yes, you, sir.
Awesome talk. So I'm hearing a lot of this, or I think of a lot of this as an identity conversation with ourselves. I'm not that bad person, they are, etc. And I'm also just wondering, what are your thoughts about how big a role our self-preservation instinct plays in that? Because I feel like it has one, but I'm curious.
So the question, just for those who didn't hear, is how much of a role how much of a role does the self-preservation instinct have in this, in wanting to maintain a self-image of myself as a good person and not a bad person? Is that right? And othering, so they're distant from me and I'm different from that. I
think so. One thing I learned when doing research on this book, and also doing research on or learning more about trolleyology, which how many of you watched The Good Place? Yay, hands. So trolleyology is effectively the study of the trolley problem, which is sort of ethical dilemmas, right? Like, do you flip a switch to save, to kill one person instead of letting a train kill 5? Like those kinds of questions, sort of like trains coming down the track anyway. Is it better to flip a switch and actually take action, or do you just let the train go? And then versions of it, like, okay, now there's 5 people, but the person who's won, it's not just some random stranger, because it's easy for us to go, oh, greatest good for the greatest number, obviously. Not so obvious when it's your daughter on the track or your significant other. I mean, I would definitely sacrifice 5 for my partner. I would probably sacrifice like 100, maybe 1,000.
All of you. She would kill all of you.
Totally screwed.
All of you.
I mean, genuinely, like, I think that we have this sort of idea of, oh, well, this is how we would act in these hypothetical, or if these situations were real, this is how we would act. But really, if you even just put people in virtual reality where they're actually having to make a decision, that's still fake, of course, but people are much more like to act spontaneously, and we're much more ethically selfish than we like to admit. So I think so that ties in the sense that I think that it's easy to look at others and judge them for their behavior without taking into account the things that that person may have thought they were doing it for, or why they were, the sort of basic concepts of like why they were stealing. Maybe they were stealing, and this is sort of, seems almost moot, but like to support their family. Or why were they dealing drugs? Maybe it was to, again, support their family or do something that actually in and of itself we consider a good thing. But the action itself that got them to get there was problematic. And so I think we need to be conscious of that. And in terms of self-preservation, I think we do a lot of things that are harmful to save ourselves. And whether that's good or bad, I'm not sure. It's probably bad for society at large. But it is also just part of the human experience.
Does that answer your question?
Sort of.
Great, awesome. Cool. All right, I'll take one. Yes, all right, from the back of the room, yes.
I have a much darker scenario. There's this guy who works at the detention center, so his job is to torture people to death.
Okay. We're back to the good place, I feel. Or the bad place.
Okay, so yeah.
Go on.
So how does he justify what he's doing? So maybe he killed 100 people by torturing them to death. It's not like an accident thing that happened once. Does he always think that it's this person is against our supreme leader, so he deserves to die? Does he just say that I'm following orders, I don't care? Just like the
Nazis.
trials of after World War II.
Yeah.
Or are all those people psychopaths? Or do they turn into psychopaths?
Okay.
They lose empathy after they kill the first person?
So the question is you're specifically interested in like torturers. You're like, when we're trying to think of evil people, the worst person I can think of is someone who just tortures people day in and day out for a living. Good. It's pretty bad. And then the question is like, what's that person like? Like, first of all, so your question was like, do they think of themselves? If we assume that most people tell themselves a story where they're not evil, what's the story that person tells themselves? Is that a fair summary? Okay.
So I think this ties into discussions that I have in the book around slavery, because I think. So for me, the hardest thing so for you, maybe torture is a hard thing to understand. I do also talk about torture in the book, but I think that the hardest thing for me to understand is slavery and sort of structural forcing people to do things, and slavery is still a very real thing in our world, unfortunately. And how do we force people, and how do slave owners, and this was my question to myself as well, how do slave owners justify that they have slaves? Like, how can you possibly justify this? And there has actually been some research where people have talked to and interviewed slave owners, which I think is fascinating. Consider that job. You're constantly like looking for slave owners and trying to understand their epistemology, their worldview. And I think both for torture and for slave owners, there's sort of two things that are happening. One thing is again dehumanizing, so sort of seeing these individuals as not really human beings or as sub-me. So at the very least, this is sort of a structure that has to happen. This is you have to be below me in this structure. And then there is, I think you're right, the sort of, with torture, it can be a following orders type situations where you feel like it's appropriate for you to do harm to others. But I think it's often justified as sort of a falling in line. Sort of like if I assume that there is this natural hierarchy in the world, whatever it is, then if you are below me in this hierarchy, to keep you in that and to keep people like you below me in this hierarchy, I have to do this, and this being torture, for example. And I think that's one way to justify it, is because you see this as the natural order, and this needs to be maintained, and so I'm going to do what's necessary to maintain that order.
Well, the thing that my mind jumps to too, and I'm not sure, maybe this is like the thing I'm sort of obsessing about during this talk with my like pet theory of the moment that all the evil is done in the name of believing in evil, is that I would imagine that most tortures in those situations, the people you're torturing you think are evil, right? Like most people who are torturing people in at least in government settings, like they're the enemy and they're the bad guys, right? So like in Abu Ghraib, like why people were doing that stuff was because they thought the people they were torturing were like the worst people in the world.
Oh, they're not people,
yeah. And they're also not just not people, they're evil. I mean, it's not just, they're not just sheep, because you don't torture a sheep or even torturing it, but they're actually evil, they're terrorists. They're people who, they're the very worst people in the world. And I imagine that probably most people who do torture for governments are torturing people who they think are evil too. I'm not sure if that's part of it, if that makes sense for you.
Yeah, I don't know that that's sufficient, but I do think that's certainly a core element, that there's this, either they're evil or they're not human like me.
Yeah.
And that's both in slavery and in torture, which of course they're not the same, but they're related, I think. But I do think there is also just a seeing it as necessary, which is different, because what you're describing is almost closer to sadism. Like, I want to torture these people because they're bad. I don't think that most people whose job is to torture think that.
Right.
I think most of them think it's a necessary piece of their job, and that this maintains order. And that is a different position. And this is where it sort of doesn't make you a psychopath. No, I would argue. It can make you act in incredibly harmful ways by justifying it based on sort of a wonky, to say the least, moral compass.
Okay, all right. I think that's the time that we've got. I'd like to ask you before we go, are there any like closing thoughts or messages that you want to leave with anyone? Anything you feel you haven't addressed, or anything you want to encourage the people here to do?
Stop using the word evil. Step one. Step two, think about your own morality more. Have difficult conversations. I think the hardest things to say are often the most important things to discuss. I think that's true in relationships. I also think that's true in life. And again, it doesn't mean that I don't want to be seen as giving you license to talk about things in insensitive ways. I think it's really important to consider who you're talking to and how you contextualize the discussion. But I think it is really important that you have a discussion in a sensitive way given the context, and that you don't shy away. So talk about taboo topics. Be fearless in that sense. Embrace it. And it's fascinating when you actually do it. So I hope you enjoy the ride if you do embrace on this journey. And buy my book.
Well, an inspiring closing note. Thank you. Thank you so much. It was such a great pleasure talking with you. If you do want to buy Julia's book, you can do that. It's for sale right out there, and you'll be signing them, is that right? So you can buy the book out there. She'll be signing them right out here. There are also drinks available in the bar. If you want to know more about me, there's an email list you can sign up, and my salespeople have scattered little flyers all around the room. So awesome job, salespeople. I want to thank everyone who worked on putting this together. That's Kian Cruz and Kate Bars, Margot Williamson helped out a lot, Shona Cook at Penguin Random House. But thanks especially to Dr. Julia Shaw for doing this tonight.